something I really harp to a lot of my patients, particularly my ACL patients, that we need to focus like controlling the controllables. I tell them all the time, like, what can you control? Right now, you can control your effort and your exercises. You can control the quantity, how often you're doing them, and making sure you're doing them correctly.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the PT Coffee Cast, brought to you by The Movement. My name is Dalton, and not alongside me today is my beautifully bearded friend William. He's checking out for this episode. He trimmed his beard up actually today, and I got very frustrated with him. So I think he's a little bit upset about that. So he's not going to be joining us today. But we are going to continue on with our ACL series. So on today's episode, we have a former PT Coffee Cast guest. Throwing it way back to I think a couple of years ago. We have Wesley Wang on the podcast. He's a physiotherapist out of Rockville, Maryland at Healthy Baller, and is very much ingrained into the world of ACL rehab. So we're excited to have him back on the show. Wesley, welcome back.
Appreciate you having me.
How's the day going so far?
It's good, man. We're slammed right now at work, and as a business owner, it's never a bad thing to be too busy. So we're just kind of getting as many patients as we can. And we have a lot of college students coming back soon. So I'm excited to work with college students. They're one of my favorite demographics to work with. So I'm definitely looking forward to the summer.
Yeah. It's a busy time when we had to schedule this podcast at 9 p.m.
That would be my fault.
And you know what? It's probably one of the few times that would have worked for me today too. So I do appreciate you taking the time with this podcast.
Of course.
Why don't we do this? Why don't you just do like a brief little introduction of yourself, just to give some context to the listeners, and then we'll dive in.
Sure. So my name is Wesley. I graduated from Franklin Pierce University with my doctorate of physical therapy in 2015. I worked at a couple of more traditional kind of physician-owned clinics for about 2.5 years, and then in October of 2017, so about 3.5 years now, I've been working at Healthy Baller. We're a cash-based facility, mostly working with athletes and active adults. Me personally, I specialize in ACL rehab, and about 60 to 70% of my caseload are ACLs, with the majority of them being high school and college level athletes. I absolutely love what I do. I love going to work every single day, helping these young people get back to their sports. That kind of is a big thing about what gets me up in the morning.
Yeah. And it's funny you say, talking about like the last like 3 and a bit years working at Healthy Baller, like the last time we had spoken to you, I think you were just honestly diving into the ACL world, like heavy. I know you were like launching a lot of like the stuff that you're doing now, like the mastermind, and like really diving into that. So it's really cool to see the growth of you over the last couple of years, especially in the ACL world.
Appreciate that, man. Yeah, it's been definitely a big blessing just to try and make an impact. And at the end of the day, for me, like I try to, whenever I retire, I want to make sure I leave this field being a little bit better and trying to move that needle in the right direction, especially in regards to ACL rehab, which, we'll get into a lot of the things that need to be improved upon in the whole ACL rehab world.
Yeah. And before we do that, like what kind of brought you into that world? I'm sure a lot of what you just touched on with like the improvements that we need to see probably was one of those things, but I know you've been through your own journey as well. So I'm sure that plays a part, but I'd love to hear that.
Yeah. So, I when I started working at Healthy Baller, I didn't really have a specific niche that I wanted to carve out yet. I knew I wanted to work with athletes. That was always the thing that I wanted to do, but never specifically ACL rehab. And then I got a girl who was about 6 months post-op. And I remember this because Teddy did the eval and I was there kind of observing, kind of get my feet wet and things like that. And this girl's leg was like a noodle. And he, asking questions like, oh, what were you doing as your previous PT? And then they're like, oh, wasn't doing a lot. They weren't challenging me. We weren't really picking up weights and, all the stuff that we hear, unfortunately, way too often. And then I started working with her. Teddy gave her to me and I started working with her. We were going like 3 days a week, hour-long sessions. So really just getting to know each other a lot. And like each week you could just see this kid like gaining confidence and getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And like every single session she would be, exhausted and be like, this is what I wanted for rehab, and feeling like an athlete even while I'm rehabbing. So I really connected with her, and we still keep in touch to this day. Like even a few months ago. She just stopped in before she went back to school just to say hi to me and say that she appreciated what I did for her and everything like that. And that ended up kind of just opening the door for ACL rehab. And then through the last 3.5 years, I've been fortunate enough to kind of make a name for myself in this area regarding ACL rehab. And, unfortunately, I have a lot of ACLs, but business-wise, it's good. But it's not that I want to see kids get hurt. But at the end of the day, when they do get hurt, I want to make sure I'm doing right by them and providing them the highest level of care so that when you go back, you feel like you're back at 100%. And unfortunately, there's a lot of places out there that kind of, just send kids back and they're like, oh yeah, you look good. You feel good. Cool. Go back there and play. And then, we know these re-tear rates nowadays are 20 to 25%. And again, when I say re-tear, just to clarify, that means either the same side or the opposite side. I personally don't care. A re-tear, a second tear is a second tear. That's what I really care about. And I want to try and do my best to reduce that chance to the best of our ability. Yeah.
And I feel like ACL from like a clinician standpoint, and I haven't seen like that many in my young career, but it's such a wide, it challenges all your skills as a clinician from like the acute stage, especially leading up into like that return to sport, diving into like the strength conditioning principles and like getting people back to like what they need to do from like a cutting perspective. And then I know a big thing now that is being talked about is just like the psychological impact around overcoming fear and all of that stuff. So it really challenges your skills as a clinician. I think it's a unique injury to rehab.
Yeah. In my opinion, I in the musculoskeletal world, not including like TBIs and strokes and things like that, I think in the outpatient PT world, it's probably one of the most, if not the most complex injuries to overcome. I think people don't view it that way, that the overall public doesn't view it that way. They just think it's like, I don't know, like kind of like a grade 1 ankle sprain type of thing. And then you just look at this blank protocol and then just follow it from A to B, and then you're good to go, when we know that that's rarely the case. So yeah, I completely agree with you that there's a long way to go for what it takes to really get a kid or a patient all the way back to, 100% playing their sport again without having to worry about a second tear.
Yeah. And I think a good place to start diving in would be, and I'm actually curious to hear how you go about doing this, because I know it could probably be challenging, is just setting, the expectation for what this process looks like for an athlete or a client on day one. Cause I could only imagine the fear, the emotion, all of that kind of stuff tied into that. So I'd be curious how you go about like navigating that.
You mean in regard to like the early phase?
Yeah. Like, what maybe like day one when you're seeing a client, like what are some things that you try to, get across to them or set the expectation for the process? And then we can dive into like the more nitty gritty of it.
Yeah. Ideally I see them for prehab. I think that's maybe another thing that we feel like is not prescribed enough. But I really, really do genuinely believe that prehab and research has shown it has a significant benefit to what you look like post-op. But let's say I don't, and I get them day one post-op, and a lot of times I honestly don't try to overcomplicate things on day one, because at the end of the day, this kid is 48 to 72 hours post-op, and the knee still doesn't feel great. They haven't moved it. They maybe haven't even seen their knee yet because it's still wrapped up and it's still bloody and all that kind of stuff. Like there's so many emotions that goes on, particularly when obviously it's your first major injury, which it is a lot of the time. So a lot of times I just keep it very straightforward. I undo the dressing. I make sure they understand what they should be doing. And that's a lot of the foundational exercises. So like, working on extension, working on flexion, working on your quads, making sure they understand that, hey, you should be elevating multiple times a day to make sure that we're getting the swelling down. Like those are the 4 things I really care about. Like if you don't do these 4 things well, we cannot go to the point of doing a goblet squat, a back squat, a deadlift, those type of things, which are obviously absolutely necessary to regain full strength. So I really make sure I hammer home those 4 things. And I tell them, you should be doing these things 4 or 5 times a day. Like you won't hurt your knee by overdoing it unless you obviously rip into flexion. But as long as you go, slow and steady and do a lot of quad squeezes and make sure you're trying to get your swelling out of there, you're going to set yourself up for success later on. On top of that, I might ask a question if it's a surgeon I don't really know that well, hey, did your surgeon talk to you about how long this process will be? There's still a lot of surgeons who will say they can go back to sport at 6 months. And I tell them, at the end of the day, if you came to see me as a person who specializes in ACL rehab, I'm going to be very honest with like what the process is going to look like. For me, it's a 9-month non-negotiable rehab process. Do you have to see me for the whole 9 months? Not necessarily, but I need to be the one. If you want me to, I should be the one who clears you and making sure that you pass my whole battery of tests before you go back into playing. So those are some of the big things. And that for me, I tell them that, the analogy, maybe stupid analogy that I gave is that just because you turn 16 doesn't mean that you have the right to drive on the streets, right? You have to pass a test to get a license in order to drive. So for us, we treat it the same way. You get to 9 months. That's one of the boxes that you have to check. On top of that, you have to pass your hop test, your strength test. We have ways to test power as well with our force plates. You need to pass every single one of these tests in order for us to give you the green light to go back into playing. So it's a whole rigorous process. And again, I make sure I set the tone early, because I don't want them to be, 6 months post-op and be like, oh, I thought I was done. My surgeon said I'm cleared. I should be back to playing. So I make sure that they understand from day one, because I'd rather have them be disappointed day one than 6 months post-op.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And you touched on a couple of things that, that you make sure they do early on with like the extension and working on the swelling. But I'd like to dive into a little bit more of like some of those benchmarks that you really like to see in the early phases of rehab and are really working hard. Cause I feel like, and again, I don't see a ton of ACL clients, but I know that there can be some things early on that we tend not to do a good job of, especially when it comes to like getting extension back and making sure that people are doing that appropriately.
Yeah, ideally, and again, this doesn't always happen, but around the 6 to 7 week mark, you should be nearing full range of motion. I would say at least 90% plus of where your non-affected side is. So I definitely want to see that. Every week I should be seeing your swelling get a little better. And that usually does coincide. Like if your knee is ballooned up, it's going to prevent you from going into like performing a range of motion. So it usually does coincide with one another. I want to see you have good muscle tone. So you should be able to do a straight leg raise by around, without a quad lag, but around 2 weeks or so. You should be able to like get a somewhat decent contraction. Is it going to look like the other side? Of course not. And then I want to see you showing like a relatively smooth gait at around 3 weeks, 3-4 weeks post-op. Again, some people take a little bit longer, and I hate giving timelines on things, but as a general thing, that's usually what I'm looking for as far as like big landmarks after ACL surgery.
Yeah, and I know, and I do want to dive into like the timeline thing and not like being holding true to those, but I think there are even those key things that you just mentioned. I think it's important for maybe there is a lot of younger clinicians and new grads that we have listened to the show that may be like getting an ACL client who's never really had experience with it and maybe hasn't seen it too much on placement. And they're like, I don't even really know that much what to look for. So I think it's always important to like hit home on those things to make sure that, people are keeping those things in check.
Yeah, definitely.
In terms of like some of the early roadblocks you might see, I guess, or places where like clients will struggle, is there certain things that pops up for you consistently that you see?
It's funny, even just today, I have a girl who's 5 weeks post-op, and her flexion is currently still only at about 110. Hasn't made much progress in about a week and a half or so. And usually we're seeing, we should see steady progress and nothing big, but 5-6 degrees here, 5-6 degrees there kind of thing. But she's been kind of stuck at 110 when she has 140 on the other side. And on top of that, her swelling hasn't really changed. And then you ask her, like, how many times have you been elevating? She's like, oh, maybe like once a day. And it's like, okay, let's get that thing up a little more. She works her butt off. She's a super, super great kid. And sometimes, to be honest, like there is some luck involved with this, right? Some people have complications, scar tissue, cyclops lesions, screw pain, infection. There's so many things that potentially can come up, and that's the risk of having a major surgery. And some people just naturally retain swelling a little more than others. So I make sure that, for her, it's like, we haven't gotten into doing anything too crazy because I need to, again, I talked about foundation. Her foundation is just being set a little bit later. So we're just making sure that we're cleaning all that up in regards to particularly her swelling, because I think that's what's impeding her progress the most. But we've done some, a little bit of mini squats, TKEs, stuff to just get her on her feet, calf raises. But we haven't done any weighted squats at 5 weeks, almost 6 weeks post-op, when someone who maybe was able to check off the boxes early can potentially think about adding, doing a goblet box squat at 5 weeks post-op. So that's the whole thing. And, we'll probably get into it, but that's the whole reason about why time-based protocols are so stupid. Because how are you going to tell me that patient A is going to rehab the same way as patient B, C, D, E, F? That's not how it works. We talked about how complex this injury is and how complex the surgery is. So naturally, the rehab process is going to be very different for each individual.
Definitely. And before we go into like the time-based protocols and that stuff, how did you navigate that conversation? Like, I feel like, how did she take that conversation? How do you go about like having that conversation without making her feel like she is falling behind, or is that something that you experience?
I try not to put it into their head that they are behind. I don't tell them like, oh, and that's why I really try to avoid telling them things like, oh, like at 6 weeks, you should be at full range of motion. Some people will ask me and they're like, oh, ideally, what would you like? And if they ask me, then I have to be honest with them and tell them that ideally at 6, 7 weeks. I tell them that at the end of the day, this is a big surgery. We try to focus. Something I really harp to a lot of my patients, particularly my ACL patients, that we need to focus like controlling the controllables. I tell it to them all the time, like, what can you control right now? You can control your effort and your exercises. You can control the quantity, how often you're doing them, and making sure you're doing them correctly. And at the end of the day, like, being frustrated at your situation is not going to help it. So let's focus on what we can control. So you do your exercises, and we will slowly keep monitoring your progress and keep monitoring your swelling, and hopefully it gradually comes down. If nothing changes in, a 3-week window, I'm a big believer in sending them back to the doctor with a potential, like, is it scar tissue? Does it need to be drained? Whatever it is. I think too many people get stuck in like, oh, I have to keep doing this over and over and over again, thinking that something's going to change. Even for scar tissue, we know that that's a complication that like 3% of people experience. And I had a girl one time, she was stuck at 125. Like we did the long holds. I knew she was doing the exercise at home, and it just would not go beyond 125. And I told her, I was like, I think this is scar tissue. I think it's impeding you. And she was telling me that it felt like a wall. So we sent her back to the doctor, got an MRI. The MRI apparently showed that it was more like a meniscus tear. The doctor went in there and removed the biggest scar tissue he's removed in 20 years of being a surgeon. It didn't make any sense. So I looked at it for about 3 weeks. Nothing changed. 125, every single session on the dot. And I was like, okay, I think something needs to get addressed. We got it addressed. Literally she came back 2 days later after her post-op. She was at 140 immediately. And she was like, this is what my knee should feel like, So that's why being aware of some of these like potential complications is so important, because you can save so much time in rehab when there's people out there who don't understand like what they should be looking for, have a complication, and they're like, let's just keep progressing. And then this kid that is like 7 months post-op physically looks like they're closer to 8 weeks post-op. And that's, again, some of the problems that I feel like we face in the ACL rehab world.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's a big change.
Yeah, immediately too. And it stayed, she immediately felt better. She like was telling me how she would drive to us 40 minutes away. Her knee every single time felt really stiff and achy. And then after, she was like, whoa, like my knee can move. My knee is fluid. And I was like, yeah, there was a major blockage in your knee that was preventing you from going any further. So, I've caught a handful of them, and a lot of times I'll push people to just get it done as far as like getting an MRI done. And more often than not, I've been somewhat fortunate enough to be right, because it saves a lot of time in rehab.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. You mentioned like protocols, and I would actually be curious to hear how you go about, like, if there is particular protocols that you use. I'm sure it's a combination of things, and why you move away from like the time-based protocol with regards to the rehab process.
So to be honest, I have not looked at a protocol in probably like 3 years at this point. I was talking to a friend of mine who sees a lot of ACLs, and who is also a PT as well. And he was saying how, and I never really thought about it that way, but there is a certain feel in regards to ACL rehab about understanding like who you can push, who you can progress a little bit faster with, who you need to rein back a little bit. Again, no protocol can ever tell you that, you know. But I would say for younger clinicians who are looking to learn and kind of have a little bit of guidance, the one I would recommend is by Mick Hughes, who is a physio in Australia. It's a criterion-based protocol, so it kind of gives you things that you should look for in this phase. Check, check, check. Cool, everything's good. Now go to phase 2. I feel like that's a lot more manageable as opposed to, you know, a lot of these time-based protocols that are so ridiculously outdated. And honestly, a lot of these time-based protocols, and I just did a presentation about this to a school. I kind of just randomly Googled ACL protocol, and like honestly, the first 3 or 4, every single one was like 6 months return to sport, 7 months return to sport, 6 month return to sport. Like no concept of like, okay, like what does that mean? Is there a test? Is there no test? You know, let alone being 6 months in the first place. So yeah, I have not looked at one of those time-based protocols in a very long time because I think, to be honest, 95 to maybe 100% of them are very outdated.
Thank you for watching today's video. Please feel free to like and subscribe and share it on your social media platforms. If you're interested, I have started an ACL Mastermind group, which is a growing library of content centered around ACL rehab. It has exercises ranging from immediate post-op to late-stage sport-specific movements and everything in between. It's a growing library and currently holds over 250 videos. There's content centered around assessments, movement breakdowns, exercise breakdowns, case studies, and a whole lot more. You also gain access to a private forum where you can engage with like-minded people, ask questions, share research articles, and share resources. If you're interested, please feel free to click the link below. Thank you for watching.